In 1847, a fur trapper named Caleb Whitmore dragged a sledge loaded with hand tools and iron hardware into the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western Virginia. He had no blueprints. He had no architect. He had nothing but an axe, a crosscut saw, a draw knife, and several decades of hard-won knowledge passed down from German and Scotch-Irish settlers who had been building in these mountains for over 100 years. What nobody knew at the time was that Whitmore and men like him were engineering a climate control system so effective that the United States Department of Energy would eventually study the same principles and confirm that the physics actually worked. But this story doesn't start with a building. It starts with a problem. And that problem was simple. If you couldn't control the temperature inside your cabin, you died. It was 1802. And across the Appalachian frontier, families were losing children to winter exposure inside their own homes. The typical colonial fireplace burned through 18 to 20 cords of firewood a year. That's roughly a stack of split wood 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 160 feet long every single winter. And even with all that fuel feeding a fire around the clock, room temperatures just a few feet from the hearth would hover barely above freezing on the coldest days. Families confined themselves to a single room for months at a time, sleeping on straw ticks pulled close to the fire, waking in shifts to feed the flames so the coals never went cold. The walls of a poorly built cabin would develop a film of ice on the inside, even while the fire was roaring. Imagine waking up at 3 in the morning, the fire nearly dead, your breath visible in the air, frost crystallizing on the inside of the log walls next to your sleeping children. In summer, the problem reversed completely. Log walls absorbed the sun's heat all day and radiated it inward all night, turning a small one-room cabin into what amounted to a wood oven. Greased paper windows let in some light but trapped hot, stagnant air. There was no ventilation system, no shade strategy, no relief. The humidity that came with Appalachian summers turned the interior into a damp, stuffy box that bred mold and made sleeping nearly impossible. The families who survived the first few winters and the first few summers in these mountains learned fast. They paid attention to what worked and abandoned what didn't. The ones who failed to adapt are the ones whose names didn't make it into any records. And what the survivors figured out, piece by piece, season by season, was a layered system that no one ever wrote down in a manual but that quietly spread through the frontier like a whispered trade secret. And here is where the so-called secret begins. Because the mountain men who thrived in these conditions didn't rely on one single trick. They layered 5 different techniques on top of each other, and each one made the others more effective. The result was a cabin that stayed noticeably cooler in the summer heat and measurably warmer through the dead of winter, all without a single piece of technology that would have made sense to anyone living after 1900. The first technique was the one that every frontier builder learned before anything else, and it had everything to do with what happened between the logs, not the logs themselves. When you cut timber by hand with an axe and stack it into walls, the logs never fit perfectly. Every trunk is a slightly different diameter. Every surface has bumps, curves, and bark ridges. And those gaps between logs are a death sentence in January. Wind cuts through them like they're not even there. Rain seeps in and rots the wood from the inside. Insects and snakes treat those openings like a front door. The fix was a 2-step process that settlers called chinking and daubing. Chinking came first. Builders packed the gaps with whatever solid filler they could find. Strips of wood, flat stones, wedges split from log scraps, clumps of dried moss, corn cobs, handfuls of oakum, even bundles of dried leaves. In the dense forests of northern Appalachia, sphagnum moss was a popular choice because it compressed well and had mild antiseptic properties that slowed rot. In the drier regions of the American Southwest, builders relied on clay and mud packed directly into the gaps. The point was to physically block the opening with bulk material so air couldn't whistle straight through the wall. But chinking alone wasn't enough. Those filler pieces still left cracks and seams and tiny gaps that wind found every time. So the second step was daubing, which meant smearing a wet mixture over the chinking to seal it completely. The recipes for daubing mortar varied by region and by whatever materials were close at hand, but a common Appalachian formula combined local clay, sand, water, and binders like straw, animal hair, or dried livestock manure. Some builders added lime when they could get it, which hardened the mixture and made it more resistant to rain. Others mixed in goat hair or hog bristles to give the daubing tensile strength, the same principle behind adding rebar to concrete. The wet mixture was pressed over the chinking by hand, smoothed flat with a trowel or a piece of flat bark, and left to cure in the sun. The problem was that daubing cracked. It cracked when temperatures swung from hot to cold. It cracked when the logs dried and shrank, which they did constantly. It cracked when the cabin settled unevenly into the ground. And every crack reopened the gap it was supposed to seal. So maintenance was constant. Every spring and every fall, the family walked the walls and patched every crack they could find. It was tedious, repetitive work, and it never ended. But the families who did it religiously stayed warm. The families who let the daubing go had cabins that leaked heat like a sieve. And if that sounds crude, consider what it actually accomplished. A properly chinked and daubed cabin wall became essentially airtight. Wind couldn't penetrate, moisture was blocked, and that simple seal created the first layer of what amounted to passive insulation, trapping a pocket of still air between the interior and exterior environments. Modern building science calls this an air barrier, and it remains one of the single most important factors in energy efficiency today. These frontier families stumbled onto it with mud and horsehair. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to a lot of people, because it contradicts what most of us assume about old log walls. The logs themselves were doing something that nobody on the frontier fully understood at the time. Wood, especially the softwoods like pine, spruce, and cedar that grew thick across the Appalachian ranges, has a property that engineers now call thermal mass. Thermal mass is a material's ability to absorb thermal energy, store it, and then release it slowly over time. Think of it like a battery, except instead of storing electricity, it stores heat. During the day, the sun beats down on the exterior walls of a log cabin, and the wood absorbs that heat. But wood is dense. It doesn't transfer that heat quickly. A thick log wall might take 6, 8, even 10 hours to conduct the day's heat from the outside surface to the inside surface. By the time that warmth finally reaches the interior, the sun has already gone down, and the outside temperature has dropped. So the cabin stays cool during the day while the wall slowly absorbs the heat, and then feels warm in the evening as the stored energy finally radiates inward. In winter, the process flips. The fireplace heats the interior air, and the log walls absorb that warmth from the inside. The thick wood holds that heat for hours, even after the fire dies down. Instead of the warmth bleeding straight through a thin wall and vanishing into the freezing night air, the thermal mass acts like a buffer, releasing stored warmth gradually and keeping the interior temperature from crashing the moment the flames go out. On paper, the insulation value of a log wall looks terrible. The Department of Energy puts the R value of softwood at about 1.41 per inch. That means a 6-inch log wall has an R value of roughly 8. A standard modern wall with fiberglass insulation in the studs runs around R14. So by the numbers, the old log cabin wall is half as effective as a modern wall. If you're wondering how that's even legal by today's building codes, so is everyone else. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time and that most people still miss today. R value only measures resistance to heat conduction, the steady one-way flow of warmth through a material. It doesn't account for thermal mass at all. And in real-world conditions, where temperatures rise and fall every single day, thermal mass changes the entire equation. Researchers at the National Bureau of Standards, which is now called the National Institute of Standards and Technology, studied this exact question back in the 1980s. What they found confirmed what log cabin owners had been saying for 200 years. In climates with significant day-to-night temperature swings, a log wall performs as though it has a much higher R value than the lumber alone would suggest. The thermal mass smooths out the peaks and valleys of the heating and cooling load, effectively boosting the wall's real-world performance well beyond what the static number predicts. An 8-inch log wall with an R value of 10 on paper was performing, in actual measured conditions, like a wall with an R value closer to 15 or even higher. The logs weren't just insulating, they were regulating. And no, I'm not making that up. The Department of Energy's own website acknowledges the thermal mass advantage and explains why log walls qualify for alternate compliance paths under modern building energy codes, because the standard R-value test simply doesn't capture what the wall is actually doing. The mountain men who built those cabins in the early 1800s had no idea about R values or thermal conductivity or anything that would show up in a physics textbook. But they noticed something. Cabins built with thicker logs held heat longer. Cabins built with dense hardwoods felt different than cabins built with lighter softwoods. And over generations, that hands-on knowledge refined itself into a building practice that worked, without anyone ever being able to explain exactly why. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Because the third technique in the mountain man's layered system had nothing to do with the building itself. It was about where the building sat. The smartest frontier builders didn't drop their cabins in the middle of a clearing and hope for the best. They read the landscape first. The preferred site was the lee side of a low hill, tucked into the terrain so that the earth itself formed a windbreak on the north and west sides, the directions from which the worst winter storms typically rolled in. Some builders went further and dug into the hillside, banking earth against one or more walls so the cabin was partially buried. Others built directly into a slope, so the back wall was essentially underground. This technique, which modern architects now call earth sheltering, is one of the oldest building methods known to human history. The Washington State Department of Archaeology traces it back to 15,000 BC, when migratory hunters in northern Europe used turf and packed earth to insulate round huts that were partially sunk into the ground. Native American groups across North America built pit houses using the same principle thousands of years before European settlers arrived. The physics are straightforward. Below a certain depth, ground temperature stays remarkably stable year-round, usually somewhere between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit in most of the continental United States. That's cooler than summer surface temperatures and dramatically warmer than winter air. By banking earth against the cabin walls or building into a hillside, frontier settlers gave themselves a free temperature buffer on every side that touched the ground. On the prairies, where timber was scarce and the wind never stopped blowing across hundreds of miles of flat grassland, settlers went even further. They built entire homes out of sod, thick blocks of prairie turf cut with a special breaking plow and stacked like oversized bricks. The root systems of the native grasses held the blocks together with surprising strength. Prairie grass roots were nothing like modern lawn grass. They grew deep and dense, creating a matted web that made each sod block almost as tough as a light masonry unit. Walls went up 2 blocks thick, sometimes 3, and the whole structure was capped with a sod roof that grew real, living grass on top. That living roof functioned as a natural insulation layer nearly 10 inches thick. It absorbed heat during sunny days and released it slowly after dark. When it rained, the grass roots absorbed the water and held the soil in place instead of letting it wash off. After the first good rain, the roof grass grew in thick and green, blending the entire house into the landscape so completely that from a distance, you might walk right past it without realizing it was there. Dugouts carved directly into hillsides performed even better. The first step was finding a south-facing slope, which caught winter sun and blocked north winds. Settlers carved a room-sized cavity into the hill, used the excavated earth to build up low walls at the entrance, and roofed the whole structure with cottonwood poles layered with prairie grass and sod blocks. The result was a home that was 70 to 80% underground, surrounded on 3 sides and above by earth that stayed at a nearly constant temperature year-round. These dugouts stayed warmer than any above-ground structure on the open plains, and in summer they were cool enough to store food without it spoiling. Settlers who couldn't afford lumber lived in sod houses and dugouts for years, sometimes decades, and many reported that they were remarkably comfortable once properly built. The homesteaders who designed these shelters weren't trying to be clever. They were trying not to freeze. And they were trying not to lose the milk and butter to summer heat before they could use it. By 1815, the building techniques that worked were spreading through word of mouth and hard experience, and the mountain men who operated as trappers, traders, and lone wilderness settlers across the Appalachian Ranges and into the Rockies were refining those techniques with every new cabin they raised. If you're finding this helpful, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten history like this every week. By 1840, the most experienced builders in the mountains had added a critical innovation that changed how a cabin actually used heat. And it started with the fireplace. The standard frontier fireplace was enormous, wide, deep, open, and spectacularly wasteful. The design hadn't changed much from medieval English hearths. You built a big fire in a big hole in the wall, and most of the heat went straight up the chimney along with the smoke. Families burned through mountains of firewood and still froze unless they were practically sitting on the hearth. The front of your body roasted while the back of your body stayed cold. In 1796, a man named Benjamin Thompson, who went by the title Count Rumford, published a design that changed everything. Rumford was born in Woburn, Massachusetts, in 1753, and after an eventful career that took him across Europe, he turned his attention to the science of heat and the embarrassing inefficiency of the standard fireplace. What Rumford understood, and what no one before him had put into writing, was that the only useful heat a fireplace produces is radiant heat, the warmth that radiates outward from the fire and strikes the people and objects in the room. The rest mixes with smoke and vanishes up the chimney. In a traditional deep fireplace, that wasted fraction was enormous. So Rumford rebuilt the fireplace from the ground up. He made the firebox dramatically shallower, barely 13 inches deep instead of 2 or 3 feet. He widened the opening so the fire was more visible to the room. And critically, he angled the side walls at roughly 135 degrees to the back wall, creating splayed surfaces that reflected radiant heat outward into the living space like a pair of mirrors bouncing light. He also narrowed the chimney throat to just 4 inches, creating a faster updraft that pulled smoke out cleanly without dragging heated room air along with it. The result was a fireplace that burned less wood, produced almost no smoke inside the room, and threw dramatically more heat into the living space. Rumford became an instant celebrity in London. Within 2 months of publishing his design, roughly 250 London fireplaces had been rebuilt to his specifications. Thomas Jefferson installed Rumford fireplaces at Monticello. Henry David Thoreau mentioned them as a standard convenience that everyone took for granted, alongside plaster walls and Venetian blinds. On the frontier, word traveled slower but landed harder. Mountain men and settlers who adopted the Rumford principles or who independently arrived at similar designs through trial and error found that their cabins held heat dramatically better through long winter nights. A shallower, angled fireplace radiating warmth into a room whose thick log walls absorbed and stored that warmth, and whose chinked and daubed gaps sealed the warm air inside. That was a fundamentally different living experience than the drafty, fuel-devouring standard of the previous century. And the same system that held warmth in winter worked in reverse in summer. The airtight walls kept hot outside air from infiltrating. The thermal mass of the logs absorbed daytime heat and delayed it from reaching the interior until after dark. The earth-sheltered site stayed cool on all sides touching the ground. And with the fireplace cold and the chimney acting as a natural ventilation shaft, drawing warm interior air upward and pulling cooler air in through low openings near the floor, the cabin breathed. It created a slow, passive circulation that moved air through the structure without any fan, any mechanism, any power source at all. The roofing played a role too. Builders who chose reflective, light-colored materials for their roofing or who laid sod on top kept the attic space cooler in summer. Builders who oriented their cabins so the longer walls faced south gave themselves maximum sun exposure in winter when the sun sat low on the horizon, and minimum exposure in summer when the sun arced high overhead. Some builders planted shade trees on the south and west sides, knowing that the leaf canopy would block summer sun but that the bare branches would let winter light through. None of these decisions were accidental by the 1830s and 40s. They were deliberate, they were taught, and they were the difference between a cabin you could live in comfortably and a cabin you endured. You'd think someone would have said something about how all these pieces fit together into a coherent system. Nobody did. Not for a very long time. Each technique was treated as common sense on its own. Chink your logs so the wind doesn't blow through. Pick a sheltered site so winter storms don't hit you broadside. Build your fireplace so it heats the room instead of heating the sky. Use thick logs because thick logs hold up better. None of it was written down as a unified system. It was just what experienced builders did, passed along from father to son, from neighbor to neighbor, from one hard-learned winter to the next. The unification didn't happen until the 20th century, when building scientists began studying why certain old structures performed so much better than their materials should have allowed. The National Bureau of Standards study in the 1980s was one of the first rigorous examinations, and it focused specifically on the thermal mass question, confirming that mass walls like log construction deliver real-world energy performance that standard insulation metrics can't capture. But the broader picture, how chinking creates an air barrier, how thermal mass stores and releases energy on a delayed cycle, how earth contact stabilizes temperature, how radiant fireplace design maximizes useful heat output. All of these were being studied and published as separate discoveries in separate fields. Building envelope research here, passive solar design there, radiant heat engineering somewhere else. It took decades before anyone pointed out that the mountain man's layered cabin was already doing all of it, 200 years earlier, with nothing but an axe and whatever the forest provided. The modern passive house movement, which originated in Germany in the 1990s and has since spread worldwide, is built on two core principles. Extreme air sealing, which eliminates drafts and uncontrolled heat loss, and thermal mass management, which uses the building's materials to absorb, store, and release heat in a controlled cycle. Sound familiar? The passive house standard requires a continuous air barrier around the entire building envelope. That's chinking and daubing, industrialized and perfected with modern materials. It requires sufficient thermal mass to buffer temperature swings. That's thick log walls doing what thick log walls have always done. And it recommends strategic orientation and earth contact to reduce heating and cooling loads. That's the mountain man picking the lee side of the hill and banking dirt against the north wall. The technology is modern. The principle is ancient. There are cabins standing in the Appalachian Mountains right now, structures built in the 1820s and 1830s that have survived almost 2 centuries of weather with their original log walls still intact. Some have been continuously occupied. Others were abandoned and rediscovered, their joints still tight, their daubing still holding, their walls still regulating temperature the same way they did the year they were raised. The oldest confirmed log cabin in America is the C.A. Nothnagel Log House in New Jersey, built between 1638 and 1643 by Swedish settlers who brought their building traditions across the Atlantic. It still stands. Its original oak logs are still in place. Its Scandinavian-style fireplace still works. Almost 400 years later, the building that was supposed to be a temporary frontier shelter is still doing what it was designed to do. The mountain man's secret was never really a secret. It was patience. It was observation. It was the willingness to learn from the land, from the materials, and from the people who came before. Every technique in the system, the chinking, the thermal mass, the earth sheltering, the radiant fireplace, was borrowed from someone else and refined through hard experience. The German settlers brought their notching techniques, the Scandinavians brought their log-building traditions. Native American groups had been using earth-sheltered pit houses for thousands of years before any Europeans set foot on the continent. And Count Rumford, born in Massachusetts and educated in the physics of heat, redesigned the fireplace from pure scientific reasoning. What the mountain man did was put all of it together in one structure without ever knowing the science behind any of it. He didn't need a textbook. He needed a cabin that kept his family alive through February and didn't cook them alive in August. That's not a secret trick. That's engineering. And the fact that it took modern building science 200 years to catch up and confirm what a fur trapper with an axe already knew? That tells you something about the difference between understanding a principle and living it. The mountain man's cabin isn't a relic, it's a blueprint. And the buildings going up today under the Passive House Standard, with their airtight envelopes, their thermal mass walls, their earth contact foundations, those buildings owe more to a hand-hewn log shelter on a Blue Ridge hillside than most architects would ever admit. If you want to see how another forgotten technique from this era changed how people survived on the frontier, that video is on screen now.